infrastructural violence in Indonesia's plantation zone. So I want to take you into what a plantation zone looks and feels like as a form of, as a built form, as an infrastructural form. If I can. Sorry, it's not letting me advance. Okay, so the first thing is to note the geographic extent of plantations currently in Indonesia. So Indonesia, as you may know, is fundamentally an agrarian society. 50% of the population still live in rural areas. So a lot of people depend on farming. The red in this picture is the current extent of oil palm plantation concessions. So you'll see it's a huge area covering vast parts of Sumatra here, Kalimantan, and extending into Papua. So this really is the shape of the new rural in Indonesia, not so much in Java, which continues to be intensive rice and other crops, but for the other islands, this particular format that I'm going to describe today, oil palm plantations, really is what's in place. And the extent is now 22 million hectares. That's really a huge area. And it represents 1/3 of Indonesia's total agricultural land. So 1/3 of land which is under agriculture is under this particular format. This is a map from the sub-district where Pujo and I carried out our research, ethnographic research, mainly between 2010 and 2015. And what you'll see here is these colored blocks are the areas which have been assigned as concessions to different corporations for plantations. This map was made in the mid-90s. At that time, some of these already existed, others were still in planning. Now they all exist. All of this area has been built. And some other important features of the map, the little white areas along the main river here, this is the River Kapuas. These are tiny residual areas left to the previous population. In this area, Malay and Dayak people. And this area at the bottom of the map, also white, is basically hilly. It's not suitable for plantation development, and it's a protected forest. So really all the agricultural land in this district has been, or this sub-district has been allocated to plantations, and the people are relegated to remnant spaces, little nooks and crannies along the borders. This is what a plantation land clearing looks like, complete removal of all of the previous vegetation and habitation, the villages, the coconut trees, the mango trees, the rubber trees, everything that was there before has gone. And in this case, it has been terraced because it's hilly. If it's not hilly, it's prepared like this on a linear grid. These are the seedlings ready to be planted. Another view of the hilly land. This is the mill where the oil palm fruit, these are fruit in the foreground here, are crushed and pressed to extract the oil. So that produces what they call crude palm oil, which is the initial product. And this milling has to take place within 48 hours of harvesting the palm. So these mills are scattered throughout the plantation zone. And from here, it's shipped downriver and elsewhere for refining and processing. This is, in my mind, a really spooky image. We made it, or a version of it, the cover image for our book. These are palms which have been injected with Roundup, which is a herbicide, to kill them so that the new generation of palms can be planted underneath. So it really is an industrial infrastructure where once the land has been cleared and prepared in the ways that I showed, one generation of palms is planted. After 20 years or so, when they're too high, basically too tall to be harvested conveniently by a guy wielding a long stick, which is the preferred low-cost technology, then they're killed off and the new palms are planted underneath. And in some plantations, they're now in 3rd generation of planting, basically in the same area, on the same spot. So once installed, this is an infrastructure that does not go away. This is, in my view, another really stunning picture, in that this hillside shows, this is full of palms, and this is one of the remnant hamlets. So this is what happens to people whose land is taken over by plantations. They're consigned to these little nooks and cranny spaces, and in this case, literally perched on the edge of the river with no farmland at all. So these are called enclaves, and they are legally excised from the plantation boundaries. So the corporation is not responsible for these people, but it has taken all their land. So that's what they're left with, kind of perched very precariously. This is worker housing, lined up neatly in rows. Here are some smallholders. Some of these plantations include smallholder or outgrower schemes in which the land is still prepared in exactly the same way on the same grid, but it's then divided into 2-hectare lots, which are allocated to families. The family is then responsible for maintaining the plot, harvesting and hauling the fruit to the wayside where it's weighed. That's what's going on here, and then transported by truck to the mill. So smallholder in this case does not mean diverse or autonomous. It means also an element of the plantation infrastructure. The literal infrastructure, the roads, are a huge problem. Very difficult to build roads in the interior of Kalimantan because this earth has no stones in it. It's very difficult to solidify and consolidate. I showed this picture in a talk I gave for Anna Singh's group a few weeks ago, and she reminded me that kupu kupu, the name of this truck, actually means butterfly. And this is a truck which is definitely not flying anywhere, but is basically sunk in the mud. Why all of this? Just to remind us, 50% of the products in supermarkets in Europe and America, possibly in Scandinavia as well, contain palm oil. So it's a hugely important industrial oil. It's used in a vast number of food products, especially junk foods, also detergents. And most important, it is used as a cooking oil. And Indonesia supplies 50% of the world's market for palm oil, of which 65% of Indonesia's product is actually exported to India, where it is used as an affordable cooking oil. So here we have one of those kind of global flows where a rising middle class in India that can afford more fried foods generates a huge demand for cooking oil at an affordable price, and Indonesia is the one that supplies it. Okay, so I'm going to leave just with this thought. This is really the kind of conceptual work I want to do in this talk. So infrastructure, thinking about this word, standard dictionary definitions. Infrastructure is the basic underlying framework or features of a system or organization. And the infra means below or beneath, and sometimes hidden or occluded, like it's structure that you don't see, but that's there making things run underneath. Very much like the water pipes and things that Nikhil describes. And it's a structure. So something built or constructed, just like buildings or bridges or dams are constructed. That's one meaning of structure. Also a complex system. A structure is a complex system considered from the point of view of a whole rather than any single part. So those are the ideas about infrastructure, both infra and structure, that I'm going to be drawing on in this talk. And I'm now going to stop sharing the screen. Plantation zone. So starting with these main points, a plantation is a structure, it's built in, some parts of it are visible, impressive, designed to perform modernity, order, and profit. I would say the linear organization that I just showed you, these huge mills, these are performances of a certain kind of power, coded, modern, and orderly. It's also, a plantation also has elements that are infra, that are below, that are beneath, and not on view. And it's violent, I would like to suggest, because of what it destroys, what it precludes, but also because of what it creates or sets in place. So much of the critical work on plantations so far, and particularly the work on land grabs, has focused on what this kind of large-scale corporate agriculture destroys, destroyed rivers, forests, indigenous lifeways, and so on. So a lot on what is removed. The ethnographic work that I carried out in Indonesia's West Kalimantan province, together with Pujo Sumedi and a team of researchers from both of our universities, focuses more on what the plantations install, on these structures that they create and that they set in place. So we're not interested in what's lost, but what's put there, like what actually is the infrastructure that's installed. So where does this all start? The legitimating narrative for the contemporary expansion of plantations in Indonesia and elsewhere hinges on the need for efficient production to supply food and fuel for expanding populations, and on the promise that plantations bring development to remote regions, reduce poverty, and create jobs. Plantations present themselves as techno-rational systems in which neat rows of crops are tended by a disciplined workforce. Contract farmers are tightly organized into co-ops, and investors contemplate tidy graphs promising productivity and profit. These narratives and performances of development and efficiency are really powerful. I would say the pictures that I've just shown you are powerful in themselves. Time and again, opposition to land grabs is dismissed on these grounds. The idea is that present losses and harms can be discounted, like what is destroyed can be discounted in view of the brighter future that is to come. Basically, no omelets without eggs. But what is the evidence for this brighter future? What is the headcount that measures jobs created against jobs lost and livelihoods destroyed? If development is about expanding opportunities for people to enjoy a rich and healthy and fulfilling life, is that actually the form of life that is installed in a plantation zone? So delving in a bit more now into structure. First of all, a plantation is a built environment like a city, but is more constraining. In a city, you can choose various routes. If you want to go, from here to downtown, if I want to go, there's like 10 different routes I could take. But in a plantation, the roads go only one way. There are usually no alternative routes. It's also an industrial environment. It only has one purpose, which is production. Roads are not multi-purpose. They don't link villages. Often in this landscape, villages are actually orphaned, don't have roads. But the purpose of the roads is to link palms to the mills. So it's that kind of structure. Villages are erased or enclaved or orphaned, and no other form of life is possible here. No other livelihoods, no other use of resources. All the possibilities that were there before are precluded now and into the future. Rivers are sometimes, especially streams, are often altered in course. Flora and fauna are eradicated and replaced. And these changes are permanent. There can be no return to the status quo ante. So as I showed, replanting is going on, from one generation to the next of palms. But even if there were no palms there, there isn't actually so far any experience, as far as I know, anywhere in Indonesia or Malaysia where this crop has been planted for almost a century, of land under oil palm plantations being recovered for other uses. People and forms of life are also replaced. Plantations bring in new people and often migrant workers. The existing population may simply be enclaved or set aside. Most locals are not needed as workers because the plantations prefer to employ migrant workers. So while their previous livelihoods are destroyed, no new pathways are opened up. If they're included, it must be on new terms, as outgrowers housed on the linear grids that I showed you, organized into co-ops, bound by debt to the corporation, and with only one mill to process their crop. So they are severely locked in by this infrastructure, by this built form. Plantations are also highly structured internally. They're hierarchical and totalizing. Space, time, bodies, movement, ranks, privileges, everything is specified and set in its place. The structure, the overwhelming structure that we found from our ethnographic work is one of loyalty to an enterprise which is characterized as a family. So the internal structure of the plantation organization is hierarchical. You know, there's a head and underlings, right down a pyramid, but the idiom is one of family, which means both hierarchy and loyalty. People who work for the enterprise are expected to be loyal to it and guard its boundaries and especially its secrets. Forms of contestation in the plantation zone are shaped and limited by the structure. Villages, you know, these people who are severely excluded from this format, people like those in the enclaves that I showed, they may protest at choke points, like at the factory gates, but everyone is locked in. Like, they're very aware that the company won't leave and in fact cannot leave. You know, it's sunk its costs in this built form. It can't simply up and go. Therefore, people really recognize that they cannot change the structure. They cannot make it go away. They can't even really change its format. So the form of opposition or the form of contestation ends up as a kind of skirmishes on the edges. You know, take what you can get out of it, learn to live with it. So typical formats of protest are theft, arson, and blockade. These are small ways of pushing back, you know, disrupting, but they do not amount to removing the plantation or redress for the harms that it's caused. So those are the kind of the structural elements which are built into the visible and the physical form that I've described. Now I want to turn to the infra elements. Like, what is it that supports the visible structures? What is it that's going on below or beneath? What is it that's occluded? The first point is, I would say, the sort of the prehistory or the hidden history or the deep invisible structure of a plantation is what Pujo and I, through our reflections on this, came to think of as a deeply racialized and colonial rationale. If you think about it, why are plantations there? What is the rationale for them? What's the purpose? What's the point? Basically, they are founded on the myth of what historian Syed Hussein Alatas called the myth of the lazy native. It's the idea that the natives on the spot are racially inferior and in fact incapable of modern market production. Hence, they should be replaced by plantations, which are modern and efficient and can get the job done. So this is a myth which was alive in the colonial period, as Alatas shown, and we argue that this myth is still intact. It's still the reason why plantations are granted concessions, and why also the counter evidence, the rubber groves and the rice fields of the native farmers, must be swept aside. So we have a structure and a logic in which the people on the spot, their value, their production, their capacities and interests have to be devalued, set aside, or sometimes actually removed in order to produce the possibility and the image of the plantation as the efficient and capable format that can get the job done. If you actually had faith in your indigenous and local farmers and their interest and capacity in producing world market crops, you wouldn't really have any rationale, any reason, any logic for introducing the plantation form. So this sweeping away in Indonesia has been quite significant, because beginning around 1700, when coffee seedlings were first introduced into the archipelago, in that case they were introduced into Java, Javanese farmers very eagerly started to plant this new world market crop because the crop was easy to grow and the price was good, until the Dutch imposed a monopoly, reduced the price to virtually nothing, and the coffee farmers tore up their coffee groves in disgust. From then on, they had to be coerced. But left to their own devices, they were enthusiastic producers of coffee. In Sulawesi, in another piece of work, Land's End, I traced an indigenous, highly enthusiastic, smallholder-driven cocoa boom in which Smallholders, most of them with land areas of only 1 or 2 hectares, jumped into cocoa production and made Sulawesi the 3rd largest cocoa producer in the world in a period of just a decade. So Indonesian farmers have a long history of enthusiastic and efficient, highly efficient production of cash crops, but all of this has to be occluded, swept away, in order to produce the apparent necessity for the arrival of this efficient, muscular, modern format of the plantation. So that's the first kind of infra, like the hidden, the substructure of the plantation. The second is the weak status of customary land rights, and that's related to the first point. As Brenna Bandar points out in her wonderful book on the colonial lives of property, if you think the native people's production is of no value, you don't value what they produce, then you don't regard them as proper owners of the land. Like they should not have land rights because they do not do appropriately useful things with it, and also devaluing the status of the people themselves. So she argues that a racialized lens applied to the population goes together with a devaluing of their production and a devaluing of the customary land rights. So this is very much the case in Indonesia. It was the case since 1870 with the first colonial land law, and the 1960 land law, which is still in place, basically retains this colonial structure unrevised. So customary land rights are subordinated to national plans for development. Until today, corporate land concessions are granted often without the consent of the customary landholders. The land is quite literally grabbed with bulldozers, which arrive to mow down the rubber groves, accompanied by police and military and by government officials. In other cases, the land grab is mediated by a pseudo-market relation and coerced consent. A corporation is granted a provisional permit and must then negotiate with customary landholders to acquire their land. But this is very much a coerced transaction because the landholders know that the plantation is coming anyway and they can't stop it. So the best they should do is to take some money while it's offered to them, however small, because the alternative is that they will be left with nothing at all. So it's a coerced kind of relationship. So all of this is possible because of the devalued status of the people and the production, and therefore the format of land holding that they have. So just a note here about customary land holding. As of 2005, only 20% of Indonesia's rural land parcels were titled. Only 20%. So that means that 80% of rural land holdings are held on the basis of custom. So we're not just talking about a few, especially remote so-called indigenous communities here. We're talking about most Indonesians in the rural area do not have formal land title. They hold the land on the basis of custom, which means I know what's mine, you know what's yours. I won't mess with you, you won't mess with me. If we run into a problem, we'll go to the village head and some other wise people who can help us to settle our dispute. So it's sort of custom of a rough and ready type, but it works perfectly well for people to manage their land relations on an everyday basis, but it's not recognized by the government, and it makes all of that land vulnerable to appropriation for a corporate land concession. So that's the second kind of infra, the hidden element. The third element is really addressing this question of, well, villagers do sometimes consent to the arrival of a plantation. Why might they do this? This is another infra or hidden element. And I would suggest that this has to do with the abdication of state responsibility, in fact, for building rural infrastructure, especially roads. People who live in remote areas, like those regions of Kalimantan that were showing up in red on the map of where plantations have come in, they desperately want access to roads so that they can develop their own land, and often so that they can plant oil palm and other crops themselves autonomously on their own land. So they may, in fact, be ready, reluctantly, sometimes tragically, to concede some land to a plantation in order to get a road. So the sub-story here, the infra element, is government neglect and abdication of the role of providing rural infrastructure, which drives villagers into the arms of corporations. Fourth point, plantations present themselves, and it's part of their myth and their aura, as rational legal enterprises. You think that a plantation comes bearing all kinds of official documents. It's there with a license. And this is somewhat true, but far from completely. What we discovered through our research is that law really operates in a very fractured and patchy way in the plantation zone. A great many plantations are built without any permits at all, and certainly not with the proper ones. Staff and brokers fabricate or falsify consent. Corporations make promises they do not keep. They pollute and destroy with impunity. So there's a lot of law breaking by plantations, but because of their aura and their image, they come looking so efficient and so modern, and they build these great big mills, and you think, well, yeah, that's all the legal and official stuff, but actually it's often built on without a legal basis. As one sub-district official said to us, I ask the companies to report to me, but they do not come. They say they don't know about the law. They tell me to write to the head office. They send their community relations officer who has no authority to make decisions. So the local officials, encounter the plantations as in fact lawless, as doing what they want, taking what they want, and not accountable or even available for dialogue. So that's the sort of the lawlessness of the corporations, which was somewhat surprising, to me anyway. Related to this, these government officials, who on the one hand have to deal with lawless plantations, they are in a very awkward position because they are officially positioned as collaborators of the corporations. So the way that a plantation comes in, it is a coordination team is formally constituted to support the plantation, and onto this coordination team is assigned the village head, the sub-district head, the district head, the police and the army at each of those levels, and also customary leaders. So basically all of the people who could be representatives of the people, or the people who one might hope, force the corporation to obey the law, are actually officially working for the corporation and paid by it, paid a retainer every month and paid extra when they mediate disputes. So there's a structure, a built-in structure, which greatly reduces the capacity of the people who are harmed by this form to push back against it. They don't have the mediators that they would normally have as villagers. As a villager in Indonesia, you don't go directly to the police or to the courts or even to a government office. You go accompanied by your headman, by the village headman. You have to have a person in authority accompany you and vouch for you. Now, if those people are working for the corporation, you really have nowhere to turn. So that's also part of the sort of the infra, right? The built-in. The state apparatus effectively becomes internal to the plantation corporation. It does not stand outside it to solve problems or to ensure fair play. So for officials, villagers, and plantation managers and workers, survival or advance takes the form that I mentioned earlier, basically of extortion, of violence, not usually physical violence. Like, we didn't see any guns. No one got beaten up that we were aware of during the years we were working in the zone. But it's a kind of built-in violence of an extortion racket, effectively. People extort the company. There's always something to protest. People who mobilize at a blockade are given a payoff to go away quickly so that the fruit can enter the mill. if journalists or officials or NGOs show up and, you know, waive a regulation, say you've made an infraction, or, you know, the company basically has to keep paying. So this was, again, a surprise. You think of the company as the strong party, but some of the company officials that we talked to complained that they were the victims of predation and extortion by villagers, by government officials, and by everyone else. They have to keep paying in order to buy a sort of ad hoc piece. But this kind of you know, repertoire of tactics, which has to do with identifying the choke point or a source of resources and then stealing it or choking it off, goes right through the plantation from top to bottom. So women workers steal fertilizer, hide it in a ditch, later on sell it to other farmers. Their foremen steal a part of their pay, routinely at least 5%. Smallholders cheat the farmers group. The co-ops cheat the farmers, the company pays off the protesters. Like, these are not aberrations of the system. These are not malfunctions. These are actually the way that the system works. So that one of our interlocutors called it a mafia system, meaning by mafia, not a sort of crime family, but a mode of pervasive extortion and rent, you know, everyone who has the chance to set up a toll booth sets up a toll booth and extracts a small sum of money from the fact that they can block someone's path. So it's one where the violence is built into the structure. It is the infrastructure. And the only options that people have in this kind of environment are to conform to it or to exit, just to leave if they can. So ironically then, the idiom is one of markets and efficiency. And yet, as I've shown already, you know, built in here is a certain kind of lawlessness, practices of routine extortion, also a mythological foundation. So there's lots of reason already to doubt this protestation of efficiency and modernity, in fact. As I noted, the built structures are performances or declarations of modernity and efficiency. But what we discovered is that many plantations actually achieve very low yields per hectare. They're not necessarily even productive in agronomic terms. And the reason is, first of all, that they are corrupt and leaky machines. So as you drive along a plantation road, the palms that are near the road probably look tall and healthy. But if you walk 50 meters inside, you see pathetic little palms which have probably never received a bucket of fertilizer in their life because someone stole it. You know, whether it was the manager who fixed a deal with the supplier, or whether it was the woman with her fertilizer bucket, like at any point in, or the truckers who bring the fertilizer along the road, one way or another, no fertilizer got to those palms and they are very low yielding. So high yield and sort of productive efficiency is not actually guaranteed in this system. And in many ways, the infra of the system works against efficiency. But it's also the very high costs, right? A structure like this has to pay guards and office workers and managers, plus all the payoffs that I've mentioned earlier. So plantations of this kind would not, in fact, in many cases, be profitable at all if they were not massively subsidized by virtually free land, by cheap labor, by cheap credit, which is underwritten by the plantation license. As soon as a corporation gets its plantation license, it takes it to the bank, and that's based on that guarantee that it gets the money to develop the plantation itself. So some plantations actually run at a loss or go bankrupt, but because they're too big to fail, they're often restructured or bailed out. So the agronomic and economic efficiency of plantations is also something that you have to scrutinize pretty carefully. I would say it's by no means, in fact, built into the system. And the two plantations that we studied, one was privately owned and one was a state corporation, and both of them were on the verge of bankruptcy while we were studying them. And yet this was a period in which the price of palm oil was at a global high. So the price was very good. And some efficient corporations were, in fact, making huge profits. But many, and these were not exceptional ones, were floundering because of the hidden side of plantation life, which meant that they were really not producing as they should. And their costs were very high. So declarations of efficiency then are built in. These are the reasons for plantation presence. But they occlude, another thing that they occlude and that they have to leave aside is smallholder efficiency. The unrecognized, and I would argue this is the unrecognizable element that would raise questions about whether plantations are needed at all. So smallholders in this oil palm landscape are squeezed out, right? You saw that map, right? There's no place for them. The local Malay and Dayak villages in our study area were very keen to plant oil palm because it's a highly lucrative crop, doesn't require much labor. So long as they have access to a road and a mill, they wanted to plant this crop, not necessarily exclusively, but they thought it was a great component of their farm repertoire, but they were unable to plant it because basically they have been robbed of all of their land by plantation presence. So the monopoly of the plantations over the land squeezes out smallholders and helps to reproduce the myth that smallholders don't want to do it or can't do it or aren't really capable of doing it. Whereas when they have the chance, they do in fact produce very efficiently. So in our study, some smallholders were producing yields at least double that of the and sometimes triple that of the two plantations that we studied. So the violence of this kind of system is sometimes overt, but mostly it's infrastructural. It's embedded in the structures, in the landscape, in the more or less occluded social and political entailments of thousands and thousands, in fact, millions of hectares of monocropped palms. So ending now, is there a better way? Yes, we argue in our book that the government of Indonesia should stop right now granting more plantation concession licenses and basically stop this train and start seriously assisting smallholders to grow oil palm on their own land. And we argue against the certification schemes, including the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil and other similar schemes, which basically set out to conduct a sort of rearguard action. They're trying to protect workers or smallholders and empower them, basically make the plantations behave better, be less harmful, be more cognizant of the local population, of worker rights, and so on. But rather than set up a David and Goliath situation in which you have these giants installed and now you're trying to tame them and make them behave, it would be very much better not to install them in the first place. Protect the power that smallholders have when they're in firm control over their own land, when they're members of communities, when they can exert on their leaders modes of social control, which are very much more effective than the ones that exist in the plantation zone, where local people actually lose any method of defending themselves vis-a-vis plantations. So it's not to say that customary institutions and the headman system in rural Indonesia works perfectly, but it's a lot more accountable than anything that the plantation installs. So corporations and government agencies nevertheless resist a smallholder focus, arguing, surprise, surprise, that smallholders are inefficient, but their evidence is thin. Smallholders can in fact achieve high yields, and there's no technical reason why oil palms must be grown on plantations. I didn't go into this very much into the labor process, but the tools and the labor used in growing oil palms is highly rudimentary, and it hasn't changed in a century. Basically, women with buckets are spreading fertilizer, and men are harvesting with a great big long pole and a scythe on the end of it, a sharp knife, which is used to kind of hook down the palm fruit, when it's ripe, and it drops to the ground, and then you pick it up and haul it to the roadside. Like, this is not a high-tech enterprise. Nothing about this is technically complex. The only technical element is the road, if that's technical. Other people could build roads. And as you've seen, the roads are not that great anyway, but the mill. The mill is a part of the infrastructure that is, it's a necessary part, but again, it does not need to be enormous. In some parts of Sumatra, they're now building mills which serve 500 hectares instead of 20,000 hectares. So you can have mills which are mini mills, which could be more locally controlled. And ideally, you'd want to have half a dozen mills in the vicinity so that there's a healthy competition between them, so that smallholders can choose the mill that treats them fairly. It's the monopoly, or in fact the monopsony, which is so damaging in the plantation system as it is now. So there are infrastructure, there are sort of technical elements, roads and mills, but these could be overcome if there was actually an interest in doing so. The question of subsidies is also hugely significant, right? If plantation corporations were obliged to pay for land and credit at the same price that smallholders pay for these things, they would be bankrupt tomorrow. They're massively subsidized and they're protected by their monopoly position. Smallholders pay real money for land, and they pay real money for credit and also for labor. In our study site, smallholders pay double the daily wage rate that the plantations paid. So they do not have these subsidies, and yet they survive and prosper. If they were in fact assisted or perhaps even subsidized, they would do even better. So it's not the overall efficiency, but the way that benefits are channeled that accounts for the expansion of plantations. That map that I showed, that expanding red, this is the infra, the hidden structure upon which plantations are built. Our research opens we would suggest a horizon of critique on the strange position in which we find ourselves today, in which in this so-called neoliberal world, said to be ruled by markets and governed by rational legal systems, like this is what we are told, rule of law, markets, efficiency, but is actually dominated by state-protected monopolies, which are reminiscent of the colonial period. The structures we document in our book are unstable but resilient. They're doing a whole lot of damage to landscapes, livelihoods, and social institutions, much of which will be difficult, if not impossible, to repair. So we would suggest it's quite urgent to stop this train before another 10 million hectares of corporate oil palm goes into the ground. And our contribution to this has been, as I said at the outset, not so much to focus on the losses, because I think there's been a whole lot of research on the losses, loss of forest, loss of biodiversity, loss of customary institutions and land rights. Like everyone, or critics are very much aware of what is being destroyed and taken away here. What we wanted to focus on was the structure, right? The infrastructure of what is actually being installed. What is the form of life which is being set in place here? And it's set in place in a very rigid and permanent way, right? So for 22 million hectares, 1/3 of rural Indonesia is now governed and organized and ordered both spatially and politically and socially, as well as economically, along the lines that we have described. So this is a really problematic way to organize rural society, right? And it's permanent. It doesn't go back to the way it was before. So we hope that our focus on the what is installed, on the structure, the infrastructure, is one contribution to turning this great big ship around. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Tania, for the really inspiring talk. And I now ask Anja Nygren to come and act as the discussant. And while she comes here, I'll briefly introduce her, even though she doesn't need it either. She's the professor of global development studies here at the Uni of Helsinki, and she has done extensive research on a broad range of environmental issues, especially focusing on South and Central America, and ranging from certification schemes to environmental disasters. And I'll give the floor now to Annu for questions.
Yes, thank you so much for your very inspiring presentation. This was really great. We are so pleased to have you as one of our keynote speakers in our conference, together with Timothy Oakes and Nikhil Anand. Congratulations also for your most recent book, Plantation Life, Corporate Occupation in Indonesia's Oil Palm Zone, written together with Pucho Semedi, who is also with us here in this conference. So congratulations for both of you. There would be so many interesting matters to talk about now, of your presentation and of your book. But I just want to make 3 points here that I consider crucial, where I think you make major contributions in your book to many kinds of fields. And thereafter, I want to make 2 questions for you, which are nothing to criticize your work, but rather I would be very interested in knowing more about your ideas concerning these matters. Let's go first for those 3 points. The first one, as you pointed in your presentation, most of the critical work on plantations focus on what plantations destroy. Your perspective is something different and really innovative, because you focus on how plantations or plantation corporations make landscapes and livelihoods, produce new subjects, and generate new forms of life. You offer a really sophisticated analysis of how different forms of plantation corporates produce massive landscape transformations and deployment of land and labor to produce commodities for global markets. What happens at the same time is that they ignore customary land rights, flexible rural livelihoods, diverse ecosystems, local knowledges, promises given, and rules and requirements to be followed. The second point is that I think you put very nicely 2 theoretical approaches of analysis together. One of them is political economy, where you analyze the modes in which capital, land, and labor are assembled to generate profit for some and marginalization for others. The second approach that you combine with political economy is Foucauldian kind of political technology, where you focus on production of subjects and control of territories and populations. In this way, I think that you are able to make a very thorough analysis of political ecologies and power-laden landscapes, where the values of different land uses are in negotiation and contestation, and different rationalities of rule are mixed and modified. The third contribution, and I think I really appreciate this one, is that you very nicely show the value of ethnographically grounded analysis. You are able to interconnect in a brilliant way analysis of generic patterns of land, labor, capital, technology, markets, and management in plantations. But you simultaneously emphasize the value of contextuality in order to show situated workings of corporate capitalism, and how land, labor, and capital configure through particular interconnections in specific places. Although in your presentation you stated that in plantations there are no other forms of life and livelihoods, none of them are possible, and that the people cannot change the system. When I was reading your book, I think, correct me if I understood it wrongly, but what struck my attention was that I think you also say that these people who have been seriously harmed and they have been made invisible in public discourse, they still persist in living, and they endure in these places, although under very uneven conditions. Now I would like to go for the questions that I would like to raise, because I got very interested in these matters especially when reading your book. The first one is that what do you think, what are the main characteristics of plantation corporations of our time? You very nicely show their long-term historical trajectories and continuities and changes in plantation life over time. You also show how they are colonial, based on racial assumptions that smallholders are not efficient producers, and based on laws that ignore customary land rights. But still, I would like to ask, that there are quite many scholars who say that we could argue that the past 500 years could be named like plantation scene. But still, I would like you to reflect a little bit. What are your ideas? Are there certain characteristics that make the corporations different now? And why there is so much investigation going on nowadays on plantations? My second question is about you make a really sophisticated analysis of how land, labor, and capital are interconnected under management for profit making, and also about how plantations incorporate a political technology that orders territories and populations. I would be very pleased if you could tell us a little bit more about what were the benefits and what were the challenges when you were incorporating these two different approaches, the political economic one with the Foucauldian inspired one. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anya, that's great. Would you like me to, I should respond to you first, right, before the Q&A? Is that the idea? Okay, great. So just briefly, it wasn't a question, but on the other forms of life. So, I mean, it's true that, you know, other species continue to exist here, humans somehow survive here, but I guess what I want to avoid is the kind of redemptive narrative, which I think we're encountering somewhat in anthropology today, particularly in our discipline of anthropology, where the idea of, you know, multi-species and somehow there's all these other life forms bubbling up. I mean, yes, there's rats and bats and lichens and cobras and owls and whatnot, but and we do discuss them in the book, but I didn't want to make them the kind of a point of redemption, that somehow in this landscape there's still this kind of hope bubbling up. And so that's the reason perhaps for kind of, you know, downplaying that a little bit, at least in this presentation. I think we have to always ask ourselves, you know, I think you know, Beth Povinelli in her book on economies of abandonment sort of talks about you know, in really quite moving ways about you know, people do survive, you know, they don't die, at least not immediately, even though they may lead short lives because of terrible water and poor nutrition and all the rest of it. But is their survival redemptive? And, you know, and she argues that, you know, we have to really, we have to acknowledge it. I mean, it's amazing that people survive, but that isn't a reason to say, therefore, you know, things are right with the world. Okay, so on this question of what's distinctive about plantations in our time. So Pujo, if he's there in the audience, will remember this, but at one stage in our writing together, we made a big table in which we tried to, it didn't make it into the book, perhaps we should publish it somewhere, but it was our attempt to kind of go piece by piece and compare the colonial and contemporary plantation forms. So Pujo is an expert on colonial plantations. He's conducted research on a tea plantation in Java, which goes back, you know, more than a century, well into the early 19th century. And no, probably around 1870. Pujo, you'll have to correct me. Nevertheless, expert on colonial plantations. And so, you know, he knows that quite well. And so we were really thinking about, so, you know, form of land tenure, kind of crop, form of production, legal regime, racializing narratives, you know, what were the, you know, if you make a table and compare all the elements, where would you say that the present is really different from the past? Because what struck us when we made this table was the overwhelming continuities. You know, all of the points in which the crops, the technology, the legal regime which supports it, you know, all of these things are actually the same, astonishingly the same. And what we came up with as the most different element was actually the relationship between the plantation corporation and the surrounding politico-bureaucratic structure. Like in colonial times, you know, Anne Stoller has written about this in her work on the plantation belt in Sumatra. The planters were a rather autonomous bunch, and they treated government officials, you know, colonial officials, as their servants, as people whose job it was to facilitate their path. And if these colonial officials tried to do something like enforce the labor law, which, although it was highly favorable to corporations, did have some limits on what these corporations could do to people, any attempt to manage or control the corporations, you know, really was met with hostility and scorn. So that relationship, what's changed now is the proliferation. So corporations, as in that period, are some of them are transnational. A lot of them are owned by Indonesian citizens. Of the private sector corporations, 50% are publicly listed, which means they're listed on Indonesian or Singapore, Malaysian stock exchanges, London sometimes, right? So they're sort of publicly listed corporations, but they often have a very heavy Indonesian ownership. So some of these Indonesian tycoons own these things, but they take the form of public corporations. They have a certain kind of exposure. But the other half are owned privately. They are private corporations. They're not publicly listed, and there's no, they publish no, they're not obliged to provide accounts, public accounts in the same way. So you have, you know, a more diverse landscape of corporations, and therefore their relationships to the political and administrative structure is quite diverse. So one of the plantations in our study site was a state corporation, and about 10% of the plantations are still state owned. So these are the ones which were nationalized from the original nationalization of foreign plantations in 1957. But the other one was privately owned by an Indonesian citizen of Chinese descent. And he was he suffered from all these kinds of predation, right? I mean, that's to say, it's not clear that he was in a position to just say to the district heads or the, all of these officials and political party, political figures asking him for money. He couldn't necessarily say no to them, right? So the relationship between the corporation and the surrounding political and administrative regime has become much more complex. There's more to navigate. And this has expanded since plantation licenses are now granted at the district level. They used to be just all of this machinations and shenanigans went on in Jakarta, but now it goes on in every district. So the sort of political bureaucratic landscape seemed to us the most different feature, really, when compared with the colonial era in which it was more simple. What we in the conclusion of our book, we take on one historian, who argued that with the coming of independence, these dreadful colonial plantations, which were based on the kind of theft of land and the coercion of labor, would be replaced by what he called modern enterprises. And I think he imagined a sort of political, bureaucratic, a rational, legal kind of enterprise. That's what he pictured, like the old monopolistic, state protected form of colonial plantation would disappear and like modern industry would take its place. But that's not what we found. Basically the modern industry retains many of these features of a protected, monopolistic, politically generated formation. So that was our attempt to kind of really nail down, like, what is new here, what is different here, and what's really the same. Why the attention to the plantation scene? So I've actually written a short piece on this recently, Indonesia's plantation scene, and for me the usefulness of this idea. Initially I was resistant to it, but then I came around to it, and I think for me the useful idea is to think about the worlds that plantations create. This idea that plantations are world making. And when I really thought about it, Indonesia's land law of 1870, which was the one in which the state declared jurisdiction over all the land and started issuing concessions, that law is still in place. Basically, the 1960 law is the same. So, a kind of a land regime was set in place in the colonial period in order to facilitate plantations, which is still the law of the land in Indonesia, right? So one could argue that this kind of desire to enable plantation arrival in the 1870s has configured land law and the relationship between citizens and state and to the present. So that's the world that plantations made, right? The second element of it is that if one takes a sort of shorter historical or a more recent period, in the 1950s, when Sukarno, under pressure from a collapsing economy, the colonial plantations had been invaded by squatters and so on, wanting to restore foreign exchange, nationalized the plantations and then handed them over to the management of the army. And so setting in place in the 50s and then absolutely sedimented by the massacres of 1965-66, in which the plantation workers union and the farmers unions were the victims of an anti-communist massacre on a massive scale, set in place a kind of a military, corporate, bureaucratic cabal, as I think of it, a sort of an alliance, which grew out of and actually for control over the plantations. So the army took control, they were nationalized, so you had this, military bureaucratic system. And this is still the character of Indonesia today. Why is it that, these coordination teams around every plantation include the army and the police and the bureaucracy, all in support of the corporation. Like that nexus, you know, which I would say still characterizes the Indonesian countryside, not just the plantation zone. So, you know, thinking about the worlds that plantations made, I would say that's, to me, another really significant feature. Okay, so on to the question of political economy and political technology. So initially, I would say in our first draft of the book, it was much more political technology. Like, you know, we were sort of really thinking about, you know, how this works as a machine, as an institution. But we got kicked by friends who said, you know, the political economy element is, I think for us, it was just so obvious that we hadn't really explored it. You know, we thought, well, it's obvious that someone's making profit here. Like, you know, why else would you have it, right? But then when we really sort of paid more attention to that and started pulling it out, what we came up with was an understanding that, I can't remember what we call it, not extraction, but yeah, I think we called it regimes of extraction. That if you do kind of follow the money approach, you will see on the one hand corporate profit, which is usually the thing that a political economic analysis would focus on. But you might miss all of the other ways in which value is being extracted here. So all of these kinds of embedded modes of extraction, extortion, like the money that politicians get for issuing plantation licenses. So we kind of expanded political economy and the question of who is extracting what onto the kind of the whole terrain. And that then, of course, immediately entangles it with the question of, well, how is this terrain organized? Right? The question of political technology really then becomes connected, right? Because what positions a government official to extort, or what positions a corporation to be beholden to politicians for its license, and so on. So the more we, you know, progressed with that, the more these sort of two fields were entangled at every point. I would say another important element for us was thinking about the ethnographic and the specific. You know, I think there's we can sometimes think of political economy and kind of corporations as abstract forces, you know, sort of running around the world, grabbing land, chasing profit. But they have to land somewhere, you know, they have to actually arrive in a place, take hold of land. Like those colored pictures on the map of the plantation zone, each of those colored blocks in the pictures that I showed you, there was work there. Like you know, you got a map and it's got your colors on it, but you actually have to take hold of that land concretely and then, you know, do something with the people that are there, and then you have to transform it, etc. So you know, again, political economy sort of and ethnography, you know, leads to a kind of more dense understanding of how can corporate capital actually run around the world and make a profit, and what are all the different kinds of practices and entanglements and relations that have to be, you know, it's what Mesladro and Nielsen call operations. You know, you have to do a lot of things to actually make capital produce a profit. It's not an easy thing. So that was also sort of part of how, for us, political technology and political economy just became very clearly part of one analytical framework. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. We have 5 minutes for the Q&A. Are there we have 2 questions in the chat, and I propose if I lump them together, and you can respond to both, and then we have questions in the audience. So yeah, if Mira, if you give in the back there was yeah, I'll read first while you bring the mic. So we had one notion about how plantations really don't feed the world, but a comment on smallholder efficiency, and then and a link to that. But then the first question was, to put it briefly, about the possibility of direct action against these plantation forms, now that it seems more and more evident that that we should not just stop the plantations, but actually like reduce their number. So that's question number one. And question number two is about the EU resolution to include like anti-deforestation regulation to especially the use of biofuels and palm oil, and resolutions and policies that big palm oil producer countries like Indonesia and Malaysia have criticized the EU for being like neo-colonialist. And the question to you was that how do you feel about such like unilateral policies? So
Right.
yeah, over to you.
Okay. So
is it really overwhelming if we actually take some from the floor as well, and then you can maybe decide how and
okay.
in what is it too much? Or there are 3 questions at least here.
Yeah. Well, I'll just answer these, but I'll try to be very brief. I'm sorry I went on too long before. So in relation to the EU, so, you know, because only a really small percentage of Indonesia's palm oil goes to the EU, as I showed, most of it is actually being exported to India, which isn't subject to these regulations. So they are not too worried about the EU. They regard it as a black campaign, and it's true. They talk about its kind of colonial colors. They say it has to do with protecting European oils, you know, olive oils and rapeseed oils and other kinds of things. You know, I think it's a very problematic argument. It's a superficial kind of anti-colonialism. But the truth is that, you know, it's framed in terms of Indonesia needs to develop and produce and provide jobs and development for its people, right? And that, you know, when EU pushes back, they are denying Indonesia the opportunity to provide jobs and development for its people. But just look at the kind of jobs, just look at the kind of development, right? I mean, it's a narrative which doesn't take into account, you know, what actually is the format of that development. So that's, I think, the way to push back against that argument that this is somehow just another colonial imposition trying to keep Indonesia as a backward country, right? On this question of, you know, should one just be limited to pushing back? Can we not imagine other worlds? You know, I would say, you know, for me, it's a question of kind of going in phases, right? I mean, stopping the train would be a good start. You know, no more concession licenses would be easier and quicker, and it's completely urgent, right? There has been some history of provincial governors issuing moratoriums on plantation licenses. That there just needs to be a lot more of it, right? And it needs to be national and you know, enforced. So that would be one step forward. What you would then do about all the existing plantations, you know, is then another question. But there's also about 10 million hectares of land which has been assigned to corporations and not developed yet. So that's, you know, if you want to think about it in sequence, you know, stop the new concessions, reallocate the already allocated but not yet developed land, you know, back to the communities, and then tackle the plantations that already exist and figure out, you know, what to do with them. But I think all of those are, you know, relevant fronts. So yeah, let's just go to the other questions. Yeah.
Okay. Maybe I have to ask you to be brief. Try to be really brief. But I wonder if this question of smallholder farming profitability is actually relevant at all for the government. And I take very shortly an example. I'm in Taiwan, where there is I see a map of eviction and what is there and what is going to be evicted. And my anthropological eye sees dozens of shops that are not in the map. Why government does not see them is because they don't pay tax. This economy has nothing to do with the government. And would then this kind of infrastructure. There was, for example, hospital that their government wanted to put there and was not there, or although it was planned. That seems to them real in their plans, while these smallholder farmers or these shops by the roadside were not.
Okay, and I'll go to the next. Maybe on the way I can briefly say what I was thinking to ask about this devaluation, that maybe if that's one of the important substrata in a way. So how do in a way counter that? And perhaps that what you were saying about kind of revealing the occluded efficiency of smallholders and so on is part of that. But what could be done in countering the very continuing and persistent devaluation of smallholders?
Yeah, I mean, these things are,
okay. I thought so. Okay, only one more question here.
Thank you very much. This is a very simple question. By the way, my name is Ayonge. I'm from the University of Lapland, and I have a background in anthropology as well. You have mentioned during your presentation that a lot of what anthropologists deal with are the problems, the critical things in these enclave spaces, which you have showed very good examples. My question is, could you briefly outline to us some of those areas that we could be looking into other than what has been done before? So thank you.
Okay, I mean, that's
I don't know if the question was clear enough.
Not really. Like, you mean what's the research that still needs to be done, something like that? Because
you have given the example of these plantations, and you have outlined that we already do know that in terms of the biodiversity, the threats that are affecting this, the threats to the biodiversity. So what are the other areas that we could look further into other than these threats, which you mentioned in your presentation? Thanks.
Okay, so on the question of, I mean, I think the question about the smallholder profitability and why this is so systematically overlooked, it really is, it's a very, there's really a very deep structure there. And I think the one of the reasons is that it's much harder to extort smallholders. Like the officials that grant plantation licenses and the politicians, they make their money from corporate payoffs. And hundreds of thousands of smallholders are actually much harder to extort, right? If they are in control of their own land, it's harder to steal from them. They tend to protect what's theirs in a very kind of feisty way. So these large structures which require licenses and which produce these multiple fronts of extraction are much more profitable. So I think follow the money is a huge part of this. And that's what makes it so difficult to turn around, right? If you were to stop issuing plantation licenses, you would cut off the stream of income of a great many politicians and bureaucrats. So it's not, I mean, this devaluation of the smallholder is not just a kind of, I mean, it's ideologically presented, but it has a kind of material core to it. What are the institutions that are beneficial to managers and I'm sorry, to politicians and bureaucrats. On the question of what other research needs to be done, I mean, there's endless frontiers. But since you mentioned biodiversity, that seems to me. I've been really troubled by the way that that this has been mapped by things like the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, because in order to get your certification for being sustainable, basically you have to confirm that you're not tiptoeing over the edge of a protected area. But the fact that you have 22 million hectares of monocrop palm can still be certified as sustainable, so long as you're not tiptoeing over the edge of a protected area, right? There's a very narrow definition of what sustainability would look like, even from an ecological point of view, that I think really needs to be attended to. So the impact of this massive monocropping and species reduction, I think, hasn't been fully accounted for. There's more attention to deforestation and protected areas, but not the impact of the monocrop as such, you know, which I think would be, if you're in that field of kind of ecology and environment, I think that would be one to work on.